So, Margaret, will you please come and begin the presentation cycle?
You know where to put my water. Okay. So, good afternoon. My topic today is rethinking the good, successful, or beautiful death. And I would like to start by reminding all of us that our current understanding of the good death is a product of our culture, our particular moment in history, and our current medical knowledge and practices. So this means that if we have concerns about our current model of the good death, we are free to change it and possibly should change it if it's not meeting our needs. Part of what brought me to this conversation or interest in this topic was I'm starting to see, I think, more and more expressions of perhaps frustration, if not irritation, in some of the academic literature about the good death. So what I wanted to do was share just two of those comments with you so you get a sense of where I think it might be going. Some of you may have heard of a woman by the name of Margaret. She is a very, very well-known US bioethicist and philosopher and a fierce, fierce advocate of assisted dying. But in 2015, Margaret said, the best that we can hope for is the least worst death. A beautiful death, that's a bit optimistic. So I've thought of that over the past few years. And then I came across a comment by the doctor, I hope I'm going to pronounce his name right, Dr. Andreas Lopesis, and he is the current editor of the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And he wrote a brief article in about 2018. And in that article, he said, and it wasn't particularly professional, but I think it really caught what the sentiment was. He said, I may be an outlier, but I just want to share that the term, the good death, bugs me. So I thought I wanted to start from there. And hopefully what I can share in the next 20 minutes is I think some of the information that may be behind their concerns. So that's what I'm trying to do. No, it's not changing. Oh, next slide, please. Learning. I've just put this one up for you. I stumbled on this literally 2 days ago when I was looking for something. Recent report by the OECD, and they have looked at end-of-life care in their 34 countries. I really recommend that people try and get their hands on it. I put the price down, try libraries, but very, very valuable. Next slide, please. So here's our model of a good death. And what I've tried to do is collect all of the terms that most of us will have heard of. So for us today, it's a good death is authentic, autonomous, self-directed, it's accepted, aware, dignified, peaceful, natural, preferably at home, attended by our family and friends. It's predictable, pain and symptoms are controlled, practical, existential, and spiritual concerns are being addressed, and dying is not excessively prolonged. Next slide. The important thing to remember too about that particular model, no, I'll save that to the next slide, sorry. So catchy little title, no, please, if you could go back to the next one, on this one here. So the number of complaints have really been captured under these 5 categories that you can see. So many people in the literature have expressed concerns that that current model I showed you is both overstated and perhaps even romanticized. It pushes, in a way, a sense that there is a monolithic single good death that everybody can achieve. People have also expressed concern that it creates a sense of failure, both on the part of the individual who's dying and their caregivers, if that good death is not achieved. A good death, many people have said, is actually a very, very privileged death. Not everybody has access to it. And more recently, I have seen people suggesting that the reason why assisted dying is emerging throughout the world is there is a sense that perhaps achieving that good death may be particularly difficult to achieve naturally. And so this is why MAID is coming into the picture. Next slide, please. More challenges that have been identified in the literature in achieving a good death. There's socioeconomic challenges. Geography is huge. Gender, age, illness and dying trajectory will have a big role. Whether it's elitist, it could generate a lot of interpersonal and intrapersonal conflict as people try to negotiate their way through all of those competing requirements. It also comes with a lot of responsibilities and moral and ethical demands that people were not aware of and have not been taught how to deal with. And of course, it is very, very impacted by demographic change. The 4 books that I put here is simply to show you that these have been published since 1996, the one in the bottom, and the top one is 2023. It's an Australian book. It's outstanding. If anybody hasn't seen it, I think it was released last month. But those 4 books are from England, Canada, the US, and Australia. So we're all continuing to grapple with this topic. Next topic. So for me, the critical question is, how often does that good death that we saw on the first slide, how often does it really happen? And how often is it happening in the general population, which normally we would understand as the affluent, white, educated? How often is it happening for people that are experiencing low socioeconomic status? And how often is it happening for people that are beginning to age? So the oldest old, really. Next slide. And this is a picture to show you that on top of everything else, we are about to experience a very rapid increase in the number of people dying as the baby boomers start to die. We are starting a little bit, but so far we are not really there. This is for Canada. This number, though, for all of you that are out there from other countries, that is actually what is being anticipated around the world in most developed countries, about a 30% increase. So if we're worried about our ability to deliver a good death now, if nothing changes, it's going to be much, much harder in the future. And I did want to point out too, World in Data, one of the most excellent sites for getting information from. So I would recommend people try and find that. Next slide. So I also wanted to balance off that good death, that image of a good death, with the reality of how people are dying in Canada right now. And I was surprised to find that these same numbers showed up in that OECD report that I told you. This was published in our Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2019, and it looked at about 1 million deaths in Ontario from the years 2004 to 2015. And what they looked at was the last 6 months of people's lives. And what they found, 77% of people were using an emergency department. 68% had been admitted to the hospital, 19% were admitted to an ICU, 14% required mechanical ventilation, 45% of deaths were still occurring in hospitals, with over a quarter of those occurring in an ICU unit. But palliative care did improve significantly over that time, from 30% to 68%. So I would think that the good death actually did improve over this period of time. But the authors were really, really careful and wanted to point out at least 2 times in this paper that emergency room visits and hospital and ICU admissions remained the same over the 11 years of this study. So I think that points out 2 things to us. So far, we have not succeeded in being able to transfer end-of-life care, thank you, out into outside of the hospital, into the home or into hospices. But I think the other thing it points out too is that how we die today is very, very difficult. And some of the deaths that we experience beyond cancer and dementia, so organ failure, those are going to be particularly challenging, I think, to transfer that care out of a hospital setting. So next slide. So if I looked at the general population and I looked at research that started to emerge from about 2000, and what they were looking at here is how often did the good death happen in the population that we really designed or designed that good death from? What was happening for them? And what every single paper has found is that the good death actually differs by whether one is talking to a patient, a family member, or a healthcare provider. So what I put on here is research from the middle paper from 2016. And they assessed, say, 10 or 12 of the criteria that we would normally use for a good death. And what they found is personal preferences, and that would generally refer to rituals, place of death, those kinds of things. Personal preferences, being pain-free, and emotional well-being were rated very highly by all three stakeholders. The religious or spiritual element was rated most highly by the individual who was dying. Family members tended to value life completion, quality of life, and dignity the highest, while healthcare workers focused again on personal preferences, helping the patient remain pain-free, maintaining their dignity and their emotional well-being. So really what this research, I think, drove us to asking ourselves is, whose good death are we actually talking about when we're talking about a good death? And they've made a really, really good point of showing that, that we can't just assume one. So it's clearly not monolithic, and that has emerged from this research. So the next slide. These are stats for BC, but it showed up in that report I showed you at the beginning. The OECD report actually mentions homelessness 36 times throughout their report. But this is for BC. BC has 23,000 people who will move in and out of homelessness on an annual basis. 39% are Indigenous, although they only represent 4% of our population. 21% are seniors. The rates of disability, mental illness, and addiction will range from 51% to a high of 67% for addiction. Our prison population ranges of around 1,600, and 75% of those individuals will be experiencing a mental illness or an addiction. Poverty rate in BC is very high. It ranges from 8 to 11%, with a population of over 5 million. 425,000 people in BC will be living at or below the poverty line. So significant challenges that people are facing here. Next slide, please. So what is the impact of poverty and social marginalization on the ability to achieve the good death? I looked at 7 papers from 2019 to 2023 across a range of countries, and consistent themes emerged in all of these papers. People experiencing poverty have fewer resources, and therefore they have fewer choices available at the end of life. They're much less likely to access all kinds of end-of-life care. Stigma and shame were particularly pronounced, and I think that's a shame. They were ashamed of both being ill and their inability to be able to take care of themselves or have the resources. They experienced high levels of untreated psychological distress and physical pain, limited caregiving. A good home death could be particularly challenging for people experiencing poverty. One of the participants was quoted as saying, "My home is not a good place to live. Why would you think it would be a good place to die?" And so for many of these people, a hospital or an ICU death actually can be a good death. So the research shows that it is elitist and inaccessible by many, many people. So next slide. Age. I really, really dislike that little statement that age is just a number. I dislike it more and more the older I get. Age is not just a number. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you go back one for me? I just wanted to point one thing out on my notes, that it is not just a number. Age is actually the #1 risk factor for the illnesses that will kill us. And that is going to remain the #1 risk factor for the foreseeable future. Next slide. Sometimes it helps to see an image. This is what it looks like in Canada. It looks like in most developed countries. So you can see this huge bulge of dying as we start to get older. If we could see an image of this back at the turn of the century in 1900, you would see many more people at the top because our children were dying. But it has moved. And I think it's actually overall a very good news story. I translated that into numbers on the next slide, please. And here you can see, again, it's a very good news story. Only 19% of deaths in Canada happen in people between the ages of 0 to 64. So we've made great progress there. It moves to 30% for people between the ages of 65 to 79, but it reaches 51% of all deaths in Canada occur in people over the age of 80. So that means that 80% of all deaths in developed countries are happening in people over the age of 65. And we've known that this is going to be happening for quite some time now, I would say for the last 2 decades. So one would think we had actually learned a great deal about how older people die and what their challenges are. And that hasn't happened. So next slide. So what do we know about dying in the oldest old? And actually, we don't know a great deal. Gerontology, a number of gerontologists have been much more receptive to admitting that none of the models of aging or the theories of aging in gerontology have dealt with death. They stop at the moment that people are dying. And they're aware of that now. So I think they're trying to patch it in. But we're not going to find a lot of information about how people die looking in gerontology. Psychology has been much more receptive to dealing with end-of-life issues. They identified this phenomena called terminal decline in well-being, and it starts about 3 to 5 years prior to death. And it's a consistent phenomena. Unfortunately, I can't find any research that's looked at what the impact of terminal decline might be on our ability to achieve a good death. And I think that would be an interesting area of research. 90% of adult deaths are from, yes, 5 minutes. 89% of adult, I thought a question, sorry. 90% of adult deaths are from chronic conditions. And again, we don't know a great deal about how that is impacting a good death. 2 quick studies. A Swedish study in 2015 looked at people in a hospital dying of cancer receiving palliative care. And they found that 10 out of 13 measures of good palliative care declined with increasing age. So their conclusion was that age was a risk factor for bad care. And then in Japan, a country that has the world's oldest population and that we tend to think of as revering their seniors, they're starting to report more and more phenomena. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, kodo-kushi. And what it means is lonely deaths. So they're finding that there are many more older people who are dying in their apartments and their houses, and their bodies are not being found for weeks or months. So they're trying to get their heads around that. 5,500 in Tokyo in 2018, but it is throughout the entire country. Next slide. Given all of those challenges for people as we age and trying to experience a good death, I anticipate we're going to see more older people turning to MAID to try and experience a good death. The average age in Canada is about 76, ranges from 18 to 91, but we are going to be expanding the eligibility criteria. Right now, older adults can receive MAID for normal age-related illnesses. When the advance requests are legal, they will be able to receive it for dementia. In the Benelux countries, they are able to access MAID for frailty and multiple geriatric syndrome, which is just a collection of aging conditions. Many more requests are starting to emerge. People are asking if they can have MAID if they feel their life is completed or they're weary of life. It is under consideration, but my understanding is it's not legal yet. And the book, I just wanted to point this book out. It was written by a woman whose mother experienced a MAID death here in BC in 2019. Her mother was 85 and she had Parkinson's. So what Elaine has done is, I think, a remarkable job of taking us through what that 10 to 12 last days of her mother's life were like and what her family's life were like. And she also stresses what the challenges are. So I think it's a very, very good book for people to have a look at. And next slide. So my concluding thoughts, I think I made it in time. I wish I had more answers for you. I don't. I have questions. What the research shows is the good death is not monolithic. So we are going to have to entertain other versions, I think. It is, 2 minutes? It is profoundly elitist. And so we need to have a look at that. Age definitely impacts our ability to experience a good death. So our current good death has outgrown increasing inequality, increasing aging, and even cultural diversity, which I'm sorry, in 20 minutes, I just didn't have a chance to touch on. One controversy that I would expect to see more of is, will the good death be achieved by natural means or by unnatural means, i.e. being MAID? And there's a lot of controversy starting to develop around whether we should even use the word unnatural with a made death. So we can look at that. One question I would like to leave, though, is so much of our concern right now is why are so many people experiencing a made death or asking for it? But I think it would be equally interesting to flip that question and actually ask why so few people are asking for a made death when it is being promoted as the sort of perfect good death. But 90% of people in Canada are actively choosing not to die by made. And I don't think it's just because they're uneducated, ill-informed, misinformed, or uninformed. I think there's legitimate reasons why. And if we want to promote good deaths in people, we need to understand those reasons. And given all of these challenges, do doulas need additional skills and training. So the two questions I'll leave you with, if it's not working for us, what are we going to replace a good death with? And what role can end-of-life doulas fill in helping to redefine a more inclusive good death?